Fire her, right now. The billionaire's voice did not rise to a shout. It didn't need to. It was a blade of ice, slicing through the warm, expensive air of the restaurant. Across the hall, conversations died instantly. The gentle clinking of crystal and silver stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, as every pair of eyes in the room turned toward table 12. Dominic Vance, the man whose name was whispered in boardrooms like a prayer or a curse, did not even look up. He sat there, draped in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a year, his fingers rhythmically tapping the screen of his phone. With his other hand, he pointed a single accusatory finger at the young woman standing beside him. "This is the most pathetic excuse for service I have ever had the misfortune to endure," he snapped, his voice dripping with a calculated social sadism. "If this girl is still wearing that uniform when I return next week, I will ensure this establishment never sees another dollar on my capital again." Adara stood frozen. She felt the heat of dozens of judgmental stares burning into her. Most people in her position would have crumbled. They would have stuttered an apology, begged for mercy, or fled to the kitchen in a flood of tears. But Adara did not move. She gripped the edges of her silver serving tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beneath the crisp, starched sleeve of her white uniform, her tan skin darkened by years of labor under the relentless sun glowed with a strange, fierce dignity. On her right wrist, a small, jagged scar peeked out from the cuff, a memory of a heavy iron pot, a crowded street stall, and the price of survival at age 16. Inside her mind, the storm was raging. "Buku's waiting," she whispered to herself. "She is in that small room counting the minutes until I bring home the medicine. Just one night. Just survive this one night with this monster. He is not a god. He is just a man with a heavy wallet." But how had it come to this? Only an hour ago, the evening had begun with a different kind of tension. The restaurant was a cathedral of excess. Golden chandeliers hung like frozen fire from the ceiling, their light dancing across the polished marble floors. It was a place designed to make the powerful feel like kings, and the servants feel like ghosts. Near the entrance, the manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, suddenly burst through the doors. His face was a mask of sheer panic. He didn't walk. He stumbled toward the staff station, his breath coming in jagged gasps. "He's here," Henderson hissed, his voice trembling so much it was barely audible. The waiters nearby immediately stiffened. Their backs went straight. Their faces went pale. "Who?" one of them whispered. Henderson swallowed hard, his eyes darting around as if a predator were in the room. "Dominic Vance." The name hit the room like a high-voltage shock. The air changed. A few of the waitresses exchanged terrified glances. One of the senior servers quietly cursed under his breath, his hand shaking as he adjusted his bow tie. Everyone knew the legends. At 38, Vance had built a global shipping empire that moved the world's wealth. He was a genius, the newspapers said, a visionary, but to the people who moved his chairs and poured his wine, he was a nightmare. He didn't just expect perfection. He demanded a level of flawlessness that was humanly impossible. One cold plate, one misplaced spoon, and the career could be erased in a single sentence. Henderson clapped his hands, a frantic, muffled sound. "Listen to me. Table 12. Everything must be absolute. No delays. No mistakes. If he breathes, you anticipate it. If he frowns, you fix it. Last time he was here," a young waiter sighed, "he made Jason cry because the vintage was 2 degrees too warm. Jason had been here for 5 years. He was gone by midnight. It doesn't matter whose fault it is," Henderson snapped. "When Vance is angry, someone always pays the price." He looked around the circle of employees. "Well, who is taking the lead on 12? Silence. Every veteran server suddenly became intensely interested in their napkins, their trays, or the floor. Nobody made eye contact. The fear was a physical thing, thick enough to taste. "Come on," Henderson pleaded. "Someone has to do it. I'll take it." The voice was calm, steady. It came from the back of the group. Everyone turned. Standing near the service counter was Adara. She was the newest addition to the team, having started only 3 weeks prior. Unlike the others who were vibrating with anxiety, she stood with a quiet, grounded stillness. She reached behind her back, tying the strings of her apron a little tighter, her movements methodical and certain. Henderson frowned, his eyes scanning her dark, sun-kissed skin, a rarity in this world of pale indoor luxury. "Adara, are you sure? You haven't dealt with a man like this before." Adara gave a small, professional nod. "A customer is a customer, Mr. Henderson. We are here to serve. His money is no different than anyone else's." One of the older waiters leaned in and whispered urgently, "You don't understand, girl. Dominic Vance isn't a customer. He's a hurricane in a three-piece suit. He won't just complain, he will destroy your future." Adara raised an eyebrow, a flicker of iron showing in her dark eyes. "Does he bite, or does he just talk?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the staff, but the tension didn't lift. Henderson hesitated, looking at Adara's steady hands and then at the trembling veterans. He had no choice. "Fine," he muttered. "But be careful. Politeness is your only shield. Be quick, be silent, and no matter what he says, do not react." Adara picks up her notepad. She didn't look back. As she walked toward the entrance, the large glass doors swung open. A man stepped in, and the very molecules in the room seemed to rearrange themselves to make space for him. Dominic Vance. He moved with a predatory grace, his expression sharp, impatient, and utterly bored with the world. A bodyguard remained stationed at the door, a silent shadow, while Vance marched straight toward his usual table without glancing at a single person. He didn't see the staff stepping aside. He didn't see the waitresses holding their breath. To him, they were merely part of the architecture. He sat down, pulled out his phone, and immediately began scrolling, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. Adara took a breath. She felt the weight of her mother's medical bill in her pocket, a folded piece of paper, and felt like a ton of lead. For her, she thought. Just for her. She stepped forward. Each footfall on the marble seemed to echo through the silent restaurant like a heartbeat. She stopped a respectful distance from the table and spoke in a voice that was soft, yet perfectly clear. "Good evening, Mr. Vance. My name is Adara. I will be your server tonight." Vance didn't look up. He didn't even stop scrolling. "Water," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any human warmth. "Sparkling, room temperature. And make it quick. I don't have time for a rehearsal." "Of course, sir," Adara replied. Her smile was professional, a mask worn with practiced ease. She returned moments later with the water, pouring it with a hand that did not shake. She stood by, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence so she could take the order. He ignored her for a full minute, his thumb flying across the screen before he finally glanced up. His eyes were cold, piercing, metallic gray that seemed to look through her rather than at her. He scanned her face for a fraction of a second, his gaze lingering on her darker complexion, with a subtle, unmistakable flicker of disdain. "Grilled salmon," he stated, as if he were issuing a decree to a servant in a feudal kingdom. "Medium, steamed vegetables. No sauce. If I see a drop of butter on that plate, I'm sending it back." "Understood, sir. Salmon, medium, no sauce. Will there be anything else?" Vance didn't answer. He simply waved a hand dismissively, the way one might shoo away a persistent insect. Adara bowed her head slightly and walked toward the kitchen. Behind the service counter, the other staff members immediately swarmed her like bees. "Well," someone whispered. "Is he screaming yet?" Adara shook her head. "No, he's just a man who wants dinner. Nothing more." The waiter who had warned her earlier looked unconvinced. "Give it time, Adara. The night is young. Men like him don't just want food. They want to see if they can break you." In the kitchen, the atmosphere was even more frantic. The head chef was personally plating the salmon, his brow furrowed in concentration. Everyone knew that a mistake tonight wouldn't just affect Adara, it could tarnish the reputation of the entire kitchen. 10 minutes later, the plate was ready. It looked perfect. The salmon was seared to a beautiful golden brown, the vegetables bright and crisp. Adara checked it one last time, took a steady in-breath, and carried the tray out. She placed it in front of him with a gentle, silent precision. "Your grilled salmon, sir, prepared exactly as you requested." Vance didn't look at her. He picked up his fork, his eyes still fixed on a document on his phone. For a few seconds, the restaurant seemed to return to a fragile normalcy. The music hummed, the wine flowed, but then the world stopped. Dominic Vance froze. He slowly lowered his fork. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He simply sat there staring down at the salmon as if it was something poisonous. The air in the room turned to ice. Adara felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Adara," he said. He didn't turn around. He didn't raise his voice. He just spoke her name with a cold, terrifying clarity. She stepped back to the table. "Yes, sir?" He pushed the plate forward. Only an inch, but it felt like a mountain moving. "This," he whispered, his irritation finally starting to ignite into something much more dangerous. "This is not what I ordered." The confrontation had begun. The silence at table 12 was no longer just a lack of sound. It was a physical weight pressing down on the lungs of everyone in the room. Adara stood as still as a statue, a dark, sun-kissed skin shimmering slightly under the heat of the golden chandeliers. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Dominic Vance slowly rotated his head. His neck moved with the mechanical precision of a predator locking onto its prey. When his metallic gray eyes finally met hers, they weren't just cold, they were hollow, devoid of any recognition that the person standing before him possessed a soul. "I believe I was quite specific," he whispered. The low frequency of his voice vibrated through the silver tray Adara held against her side. "I asked for medium. This." He picked up his silver knife, not to eat, but to dissect. He pressed the blade into the center of the pink flesh. "This is overcooked. It is dry. It is an insult to the ingredient, and more importantly, it is an insult to my time." Adara looked down at the plate. From her professional vantage point, the salmon was a perfect translucent pink in the center, exactly what any master chef would define as medium. But she knew this wasn't about the temperature of the fish. This was about power. This was about a man who had spent his entire day moving billions of dollars, now needing to prove he could move a human being to tears. "I apologize, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I can have the kitchen prepare a fresh fillet for you immediately. It would take no more than 7 minutes. That do." Dominic leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, cruel smirk spreading across his face. He didn't look at the fish anymore. He looked at her. He scanned her from her polished shoes to her dark, tied-back hair, his gaze lingering with a sneer on the tan of her forearms. 7 minutes, he repeated, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of the surrounding diners. "Do you have any idea what 7 minutes of my life is worth, girl? You could work in this grease trap for a decade and not earn enough to buy 7 minutes of my attention." At that moment, Mr. Henderson, the manager, appeared at the edge of the table. His face was the color of ash, his hands clasped so tightly together they were shaking. "Mr. Vance, please, 1,000 apologies," Henderson stammered, bowing so low he was almost doubled over. "A terrible oversight by the kitchen. We will rectify it at once. The entire meal is, of course, on the house." Vance didn't even acknowledge Henderson's existence. His eyes remained locked on Adara, like a hawk watching a field mouse. "Is she new?" Vance asked, his tone shifting to a mock inquisitive drawl. "Yes, sir. Only 3 weeks," Henderson rushed to answer. "She's still learning the standards of a man of your stature." "That explains it," Vance muttered, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "The lack of refinement, the coarseness." He gestured vaguely at Adara's dark skin. "Perhaps she's more suited for a roadside diner. Somewhere where overcooked is the gold standard and the customers don't know the difference between salmon and sawdust." The insult felt like a physical blow to Adara's chest. Roadside diner. He was mocking the very life she had come from, the long hours helping her mother at the street stalls, the sweat, the sun, the honest work that had fueled her survival. She felt the sting of the scar on her wrist, a reminder of a life he couldn't possibly understand. "With all due respect, sir," Adara said, her voice cutting through Henderson's frantic apologies. "I delivered the dish exactly as the chef prepared it. It was checked by 2 people before it left the heat. The restaurant went even quieter, if that were possible." Henderson gasped, his eyes wide with horror. Vance's expression changed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a dark, amused spark. "Are you arguing with me?" "I am explaining the situation, sir," she replied evenly. "Elena," Henderson hissed under his breath. "Apologize. Now." But Adara didn't move. She couldn't. If she bowed now, she wasn't just apologizing for a piece of fish. She was agreeing with him. She was agreeing that her life, her skin, and her mother's sacrifice were worth less than his 7 minutes. Dominic Vance stood up. He was tall, and his shadow seemed to swallow the table. He leaned in close, so close she could smell the expensive sandalwood of his cologne and the cold scent of his indifference. "You've got confidence, I'll give you that," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly intimate level. "But in my world, confidence without competence is just arrogance, and arrogance from a servant is something I do not tolerate." He turned his head slightly toward the manager, though his eyes never left Adara's. "Fire her, right now." The words landed like a gavel in a courtroom. "Mr. Vance." "Surely." Henderson tried to plead. "I said fire her," Vance repeated, his voice turning into a serrated edge. "I don't want someone like this serving me, or anyone else in this city. She is incompetent. She is disrespectful. And if she is still on the payroll by the time I finish my wine, I will call the owner of this building and tell him exactly why I am moving my headquarters to another district." Henderson's jaw dropped. The threat was nuclear. Losing Vance's patronage was one thing. Losing his influence over the district's real estate was a death sentence for the restaurant. The manager turned toward Adara. His eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and desperate self-preservation. "Adara, I'm sorry," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. "Give me your notepad. Go to the back. Pack your things." Adara felt a cold numbness spreading from her fingertips to her heart. The medicine, she thought. The bills. The rent. Everything she had worked for was evaporating because a man didn't like the shade of pink in his dinner. She looked at Dominic Vance. He was already sitting back down, picking up his wine glass as if he had just finished a mundane task, like swatting a fly. He was satisfied. He had executed her livelihood in front of an audience, and he hadn't even broken a sweat. "Well," Rance said, looking up with a bored expression as Adara remained standing there, "the execution is over. Why are you still on my stage?" Adara's hand went to the collar of her uniform. She felt the cold, hard metal of the silver pendant hidden beneath the fabric. The internal stakes were no longer just about money. They were about the ghost of the man her mother had loved, a man who was supposed to be kind, a man who was supposed to be hopeful. She looked at the billionaire, seeing for the first time the faint lines around his eyes that matched the ones in the old crumpled photograph in her locker. "You really don't recognize me, do you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it had a frequency that made Dominic Vance stop with the wineglass halfway to his lips. "Recognize you?" He let out a short, sharp laugh that held no mirth. "Why on earth would I recognize a waitress?" The words hung in the air, a final stinging insult. Adara slowly unbuttoned the top of her uniform, her fingers steady, her eyes never leaving his. "I never thought," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word, "that my own father would be the one to try and destroy my life." The wine glass in Vance's hand didn't fall. It didn't break, but the liquid inside began to ripple as his hand started to shake. The restaurant didn't just go silent. It felt as if the very oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The manager, Mr. Henderson, froze with his hand midair, his face contorting from professional panic to absolute, bone-chilling shock. Nearby, a wealthy couple at table 10 stopped their conversation, a silver fork clattering onto a china plate with a sound like a gunshot. Dominic Vance did not move. The wine in his glass continued to ripple, a tiny rhythmic storm reflecting the sudden tremor in his hand. He stared at Adara, his grey eyes searching her face, not as a predator anymore, but as a man who had just seen a ghost materialize in the middle of a crowded room. Then he laughed. It was a cold, jagged sound that scraped against the elegant walls. "That is a creative attempt," he said, his voice regaining its razor-sharp edge, though it lacked its previous stability. "Is the first step to succeed. There's the first step." Inventing a lineage to avoid a pink slip is pathetic, even for someone of your background. He leaned back, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for an audience to share in the absurdity. I don't have children, I have an empire. I have legacy. I do not have waitresses. Adara didn't flinch. She stood tall, her shoulders back, her dark skin glowing under the warm light like polished mahogany. She felt the weight of every insult he had hurled at her, the coarseness, the lack of refinement, the roadside diner, and she used them as fuel. Are you sure about that, Dominic? She asked. The use of his first name was a physical strike. It stripped away the billionaire, the titan, the Mr. Vance, and left only the man. You're either delusional, he snapped, his face reddening with a mixture of anger and a growing, terrifying uncertainty, or you're running a very dangerous stunt. I suggest you walk away before I involve the police. Adara didn't walk away. Instead, she reached into the collar of her uniform. Her fingers found the thin, worn silver chain. With a single, fluid motion, she pulled it out. The silver pendant dangled in the air, swaying gently between them. It was a simple piece of small, etched locket, tarnished by time, but polished by the constant touch of her mother's worried hands. The courage to just leave Dominic's face, it vanished, leaving him a ghastly, translucent grey. He stared at the locket. He knew the weight of it. He knew the way the light caught the specific hand-etched pattern on the surface. He had bought it in a dusty little shop near a high school football field, spending 3 weeks of grocery money just to see a girl smile. 20 years ago, a lifetime ago, Adara's voice was a calm, steady blade. My mother's name is Lydia Carter. The name hit Dominic like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He lurched forward slightly, his grip on the wineglass tightening so hard the stem creaked. The golden chandeliers, the marble floors, the staring socialites, it all blurred into a hazy, distant background. All he could see was that silver pendant and the girl with the tan skin and the fierce, familiar eyes. Lydia, he whispered. The word sounded foreign in his mouth, a relic of a man he had buried under mountains of gold and iron. She kept it, Adara continued, her eyes burning with 20 years of unspoken questions. She wore it every day while she scrubbed floors. She wore it when she walked 3 miles to work because the bus fare was too expensive. She wore it every time she told me that the man who gave it to her was kind, that he had dreams, that he was hopeful. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. It had felt louder than any shout. But looking at you tonight, looking at the way you treat people who have nothing, I realized she was wrong. You aren't that man. You're just a hollow suit with a loud voice. Dear black sister. Dominic tried to find his voice, but it was trapped in a throat that felt like it was filled with dry sand. How did you... She tried to find you, Dominic, Adara interrupted, her voice cracking for the first time. When she found out she was pregnant, she didn't run. She went to your house. She sat on the curb for 5 hours, waiting for the boy she loved to come home. Dominic's brow furrowed. I was never told. I was at the office. I was starting the firm. You weren't at the office. You were being protected. Adara spat the word like venom. She told me she finally spoke to someone. A man in a dark suit. Your father. A cold chill, sharper than any winter wind, raced through Dominic. His father. A man of reputation. A man who viewed Lydia Carter as a stain on the Vance family's upward trajectory. He told her she wasn't welcome, Adara said, her eyes locked on his. He told her that if she tried to ruin your brilliant future with a story about a baby, he would make sure she regretted ever being born. He told her you didn't want to see her, that you had called her a mistake. I never said that, Dominic gasped, his hand finally letting go of the glass. It tipped over, the red wine spilling across the white tablecloth like a widening pool of blood. I thought she just moved on. I thought she didn't want the life I was building. She believed him, Adara said, her voice dripping with the mic drop finality of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She was 18. She was terrified. She had no money and no one to turn to. So she did the only thing she could. She disappeared to protect me. She looked at the spilled wine, then back at his trembling hands. So, go ahead, Mr. Vance. Fire me, call the owner. Destroy my career in this restaurant. It's the only thing you know how to do, isn't it? Breaking things that are smaller than you. Oh, damn, how may say. Dominic Hale, the man who feared no one, was now staring at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Even the music seemed to have faded into the walls. He looked up at Adara. For the first time, he didn't see a waitress. He didn't see an incompetent servant. He saw the curve of Lydia's jaw. He saw the stubborn fire that had once made him fall in love. He saw 20 years of a life he had missed, staring back at him with a tan face and a jagged scar on its wrist. Adara. He breathed, the name finally tasting real. Don't, she said, stepping back. Don't say my name like you have the right to. You've had your 7 minutes, Dominic, and you spent them trying to kill my spirit. She reached back and began unknotting her apron. The white fabric fell to the marble floor, a discarded shroud. I'm done serving you. I'm done serving all of you. She turned and began to walk away, her head held high, leaving the billionaire alone at table 12, surrounded by the wreckage of a meal he couldn't eat and a life he could no longer recognize. The silence in the restaurant was no longer expectant. It was heavy, like the air before a devastating storm. Dominic Vance sat paralyzed, his hand hovering over the blood-red stain on the white linen. For 20 years he had told himself a story. He was the hero of his own epic, the man who had turned a small inheritance into a global empire through sheer will and sacrifice. He had convinced himself that Lydia, the girl with the infectious laugh and the grounding touch, had simply outgrown his ambition. He thought she had looked at the cold iron world he was building and decided she wanted no part of it. He had nursed that rejection like a wound, using the pain to harden his heart until it was as impenetrable as the hulls of his ships. But now the truth was a jagged blast shard, cutting through his delusions. Nonsense, he managed to choke out, his voice a ghost of its former power. This is a calculated lie. I have no children. I have vetted every person in my life. This is impossible. Adara stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She let the weight of his denial hang in the air, a final testament to his cowardice. Then she slowly reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small rectangular object, an old physical photograph, its edges frayed and yellowed by 2 decades of humidity and tears. She walked back to table 12. She didn't place it down gently. She slapped it onto the damp, wine-stained cloth right in the center of his world. Look at it, Dominic, she commanded. Dominic's eyes drifted down. The breath left his lungs as if he had been struck in the chest. It was a photo from a summer evening at a beach he hadn't thought of in years. There he was, younger, leaner, his hair tousled by the wind, his arm thrown around a girl whose smile seemed to contain all the light in the universe. They were laughing. They looked like 2 people who believed the world was a gift, not a battlefield. He remembered that day. He remembered the smell of the salt air and the way Lydia had told him that his dreams were big, but his heart was bigger. He remembered giving her the necklace that very night. My father, Dominic whispered, his mind racing through the corridors of the past. He told me she left for the city. He said she found someone else. Someone with stability. He said she didn't want to wait for a man who spent 18 hours a day in the shipyard. He lied, Adara said, her voice a cold, hard gavel. He didn't just protect your future, Dominic. He murdered hers. He saw a young woman with a dark complexion and no pedigree, and he decided she was a complication to be erased. And you? You were so blinded by your own genius that you never once looked back to see who you were leaving behind in the dust. Dominic looked from the photo to Adara. He looked at her tan skin, the exact shade of Lydia's, after a summer in the sun. He looked at the curve of her eyebrows, identical to the man in the photograph. But most of all, he looked at her hands. His own hands were soft, pampered, the hands of a man who signed papers and shook hands in climate-controlled rooms. Adara's hands were different. They were the color of rich earth, etched with the fine lines of hard labor and marked by that jagged scar on the wrist. They were the hands of a survivor. They were the hands of the daughter he had spent 20 years unknowingly insulting. I didn't know, he stammered, the words feeling pathetic even as they left his lips. That is the greatest sin of all, isn't it? Adara replied, her voice dripping with a quiet, devastating contempt. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You were too busy becoming the great Dominic Vance to notice that the woman who loved you was cleaning houses just to buy milk for your child. The psychological execution had come full circle. The man who had tried to destroy a waitress's life was now being dismantled by the truth of his own. Every socialite in the room was watching him, the genius, the titan, crumble into a heap of regret. 20 years, Dominic murmured, his eyes fixed on the photograph. 20 years of moments, birthdays, first steps, gone. Because I believed a lie that was convenient for my ambition. You didn't just believe it, Adara corrected him, leaning in so the manager couldn't hear. You embraced it. It gave you an excuse to be the cold, unfeeling man you are today. It was easier to be a victim of a woman's departure than a man responsible for a family's struggle. Dominic felt a wave of nausea. He thought of the times he had complained about lazy staff, the times he had demanded perfection from people who were working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. He had become the very man his father was, a man who valued reputation over humanity and profit over people. What happened to her? He asked, his voice trembling with a terrifying possibility. Where is Lydia now? Adara's expression didn't soften. If anything, it turned to stone. She is in a place where your money can't reach the past, Dominic. She is in a place where your influence means nothing. Dominic's heart skipped a beat. Is she gone? Adara didn't answer immediately. She let him feel the agonizing weight of that silence. She let him experience, for 1 minute, the terror of a permanent loss, the same terror Lydia had felt 20 years ago when she realized she was truly alone. Finally, Adara spoke, her voice low and heavy with a new kind of pain. She's alive, but she's not the girl in that photo anymore. Life, and men like you, took that girl away a long time ago. Dominic stood up, his chair screeching against the marble floor. The sound was like a cry of pain. He didn't look at the manager. He didn't look at his bodyguard. He didn't look at the stunned audience. He looked at his daughter, the waitress with the tan skin and the iron soul. Take me to her, he pleaded. It wasn't a command. It wasn't an order from a billionaire. It was a beggar's request. Please, Adara, take me to her. Adara looked at him for a long, silent moment. She saw the billionaire fading, replaced by a man who was finally, painfully, waking up. You want to see her? She asked, her voice cold. After you just tried to get me fired? After you insulted the very life she built for me? I was wrong, Dominic whispered, loud enough for the whole room to hear. I have been wrong for 20 years. Adara sipped a breath, her hand going to the silver pendant one last time. Follow me, she said, but don't bring your suit. Don't bring your ego. And don't bring your checkbook. Because where we're going, none of those things have any value. The rat asked. She turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the golden chandeliers behind. Dominic Vance, the most feared man in the city, didn't hesitate. He stepped over the spilled wine, ignored his bodyguard's confused look, and followed his daughter out into the dark, uncertain night. The drive across the city felt like a descent from the heavens into the raw, beating heart of the earth. Dominic Vance sat in the back of his sleek, midnight black sedan, but for the first time, the climate-controlled interior felt like a tomb. He stared out the window as the glittering skyscrapers, the monuments to his own ego, thinned out, replaced by rows of weathered brick buildings and streets lit by flickering amber lamps. Beside him, Adara sat in a silence so thick it was agonizing. She didn't look at the leather upholstery. She didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, her tan jaw set in a line of iron. Under the dim streetlights passing by, Dominic couldn't stop looking at her profile. The way she held herself, the quiet, simmering anger. It was Lydia. It was the woman he had loved, distilled into a weapon of truth. "How long?" Dominic whispered, his voice cracking the silence like dry parchment. "How long has she been like this?" Adara didn't turn her head. "Like what, Dominic?" "Poor, tired, invisible to people like you. She's been like this since the day your father's security guard pushed an 18-year-old girl into the mud and told her she was a parasite." Dominic flinched. The word parasite felt like a physical burn. He thought of his father, the man he had emulated, the man whose legacy he had spent his life expanding. He realized now that the foundation of his empire wasn't just gold and steel. It was built on the broken spirits of the people his family had stepped over to reach the top. "I didn't know about the guard," he managed to say. "I swear I would have." "You would have what?" Adara finally turned, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, violent intensity. "You would have written a check. You would have bought her silence. You were 20 years old, Dominic. You were already obsessed with being the next big thing. You didn't want a girl from the wrong side of the tracks holding you back. You were relieved when she disappeared, weren't you? Admit it, it made your climb so much cleaner." Dominic opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the photograph still clutched in his hand. Was she right? Had there been a part of him deep down that found her absence convenient? The guilt pressed against his chest, the suffocating weight that no amount of money could lift. "Stop the car," Adara commanded suddenly. The driver pulled over in front of a modest, aging apartment complex. The paint was peeling, and the metal fire escapes were rusted, clinging to the brick like skeletal fingers. This wasn't the slum, but it was a place where every dollar was earned through sweat and sacrifice. It was a world away from the marble floors of Table 12. "She lives here," Adara said, stepping out of the car. "She's lived in places like this for 20 years. While you were arguing about the temperature of your wine, she was calculating if we could afford both heating and antibiotics." Dominic stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. The air here smelled of damp concrete and cheap detergent. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of shame looking at his tailored suit. He felt like a grotesque intruder. "Wait," Dominic said, reaching for his wallet out of habit. Adara stopped and looked at his hand. Her lip curled in a sneer that cut deeper than any insult. "What did I tell you in the restaurant, Dominic? Put that away. Your money's just paper here. It can't buy back the years she spent crying in the dark." So I wouldn't hear her. They walked up the cramped, dimly lit stairwell. Every creak of the wood felt like a heartbeat. On the third floor, Adara stopped in front of door 3B. She didn't knock immediately. She turned to look at him, her expression shifting from anger to a strange, protective sorrow. "She's sick, Dominic," Adara whispered. "The nakur nethnesmnissa, it went up to Riapan, hit him then, sharper than any previous blow. Her lungs, years of inhaling, cleaning chemicals in unventilated rooms. The doctors say it's treatable, but the specialists, the ones who actually care, they don't work for free." Dominic felt the world tilt. "Why didn't you? You should have come to me. You knew who I was. Come to you?" Adara let out a short, bitter laugh. "And say what?" "Hello, Mr. Billionaire, remember the girl you called a mistake 20 years ago? Well, I'm the complication she had. Can I have some money? You saw how you treated me tonight, Dominic. You tried to destroy my life over a piece of fish. Why would I ever trust you with hers?" Before he could answer, the door opened. A woman stood there, framed by the warm, dim light of a small kitchen. Time had been cruel to Lydia Carter, but it hadn't been able to extinguish the spark in her eyes. Her hair was pulled back, streaked with silver, and her face was lined with the maps of 1,000 worries. But when she saw Adara, she smiled a soft, beautiful thing that broke Dominic's heart into 1,000,000 pieces. "Hey, sweetheart," Lydia said, her voice raspy. "You're late. I was starting to." Her gaze shifted. She saw the man standing in the shadows of the hallway. The smile didn't just fade. It vanished, replaced by a look of such profound, agonizing shock that Dominic felt he might collapse. "Alexander," she whispered. She used his middle name, the name only she had ever used. "Lydia," Dominic said, his voice barely a breath. For a long minute, no one moved. The ghost of the beach, the girl in the photograph, and the woman in the doorway collided in Dominic's mind. He saw the truth of the last 20 years written in the hollows of her cheeks and the tremor in her hands. "How?" Lydia asked, looking at Adara with confusion and fear. "How did he find us?" "He didn't find us, Ma," Adara said, stepping into the room and taking her mother's hand. "He tried to have me fired tonight. He didn't even know who I was. He was just being himself." Lydia looked back at Dominic. There was no anger in her eyes, only a weary, soul-crushing disappointment. "I told her you were a good man once, Alexander. I told her you had dreams of changing the world. I told her you were kind. I was lied to, Lydia." Dominic stepped into the small apartment, his presence filling the tiny space. "My father, he told me you left. He said you didn't want me." Lydia gave a sad, knowing nod. "And you believed him? Because it was easier than looking for a girl who had nothing to offer you but love." Dominic fell into a small, mismatched wooden chair. The psychological empire he had built was gone. He wasn't a titan. He wasn't a genius. He was a man who had traded his soul for a throne, only to find out the throne was built on the bones of his own family. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed, burying his face in his pampered hands. "Lydia, Adara, I'm so sorry." Adara stood by the window looking at him with cold, clinical eyes. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer forgiveness. "I already spoke to a specialist on the way here," Dominic said, looking up, his eyes red. "The best in the country. He's waiting for my call. We'll get you the best care. We'll move you out of here." "Well, stop," Adara said. Her voice was like a whip. "You're doing it again. You're trying to solve a soul ache with a bank account. You think because you can buy a hospital it makes up for the 20 years my mother spent wondering why the man she loved hated her so much?" Dominic winced. "I don't know what else to do, Adara. I'm a man of business. I fix things." "Idor, Nat." "Then start by fixing yourself," Adara said, stepping toward him. "Go back to that restaurant, finish your dinner, pay your bill, and tomorrow morning you come back here. Not as a billionaire, not as a savior, but as a man who owes 2 women a lifetime of explanations." She walked to the door and held it open. The swum. "Ha, nashka ha, nasha." Senior Hovkerm, Hamgismal, reverse humiliation was complete. She was showing him the door to his own redemption, but she was making him walk through the fire to get there. Dominic stood up. He looked at Lydia, who was watching him with a faint, flickering hope. He looked at Adara, who was watching him with a challenge. "I'll be here," he promised, "at dawn." "Don't be late," Adara said, her voice soft but firm. "My mother has waited long enough." Dominic stepped out into the hallway. As the door clicked shut, he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to go back to his penthouse. He didn't want his empire, he wanted the dirt, the struggle, and the chance to finally, truly, become a man. The dawn did not break with a roar. It crept into the city like a quiet confession. Dominic Vance stood on the sidewalk outside the weather department building, his charcoal suit jacket draped over one arm, his silk tie loosened and forgotten. He had not slept. He had spent the night sitting in the back of his car, watching the rhythmic pulse of the streetlights and listening to the silence of a world he had ignored for 2 decades. He looked at his hands, the soft, manicured hands of a titan. Then he looked at the rusted railing of the stairwell. It began to climb. When he reached all 3B, he didn't knock with the authority of the billionaire. He tapped gently, his heart thumping against his ribs with a nervous energy he hadn't felt since his first multi-million-dollar negotiation. The door opened. It was Adara. Her dark, sun-kissed skin looked even more vibrant in the morning light. Her eyes weary but sharp. She scanned him from head to toe, noting the wrinkled shirt and the shadows under his eyes. She didn't move to let him in immediately. "You're early," she said. "I didn't want to waste another minute," Dominic replied. His voice was raspy, stripped of its usual rehearsed resonance. Is she awake?" Adara stepped aside, a silent invitation. The apartment smelled of chamomile tea and old books. In the small living area, Lydia sat on a worn velvet sofa, a knitted shawl draped over her thin shoulders. She looked fragile, like a piece of fine porcelain that had been glued back together too many times. But when she looked up at him, the strength in her gaze was undeniable. "Alexander," she said softly. Dominic walked toward her, but he didn't sit on the expensive chair he had occupied the night before. Instead, he knelt on the faded carpet at her feet. It was a gesture of total surrender. "I spent the night thinking about that beach," Dominic whispered. "About the man I was. I hated him for a long time, Lydia. I thought he was weak because he loved someone more than his career. I spent 20 years trying to kill that version of myself." Lydia reached out, her fingers rough from decades of labor, lightly touching his hair. "You didn't kill him, Alexander. You just locked him in a golden cage." "Adara told me about the doctors," Dominic said, looking up, his eyes swimming with a vulnerability he hadn't shown since childhood. "I've already arranged for a medical transport, not to a sterile hospital ward, but to a private clinic in the mountains. Fresh air, the best specialists. It's already paid for. No debt. No strings." Lydia shook her head slowly. "I told you we aren't charity cases." "It's not charity," Dominic interrupted, his voice firming. "It's a dividend. 20 years of interest on a debt I can never fully repay. It's for Adara, too. She shouldn't have to spend her youth scrubbing floors because I was too blind to see my own family. To that. Adara stood by the small kitchen table watching them. The internal stakes had shifted. She saw the man who had tried to fire her now begging for the chance to care for her mother. Cam, the verdict of conscience had finally been served. "What about the restaurant?" Adara asked, her arms crossed. "What about the incompetent waitress you wanted erased from the city?" Dominic looked at his daughter. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I called the owner of the building at 4 this morning. I bought the lease, not to close it, but to give it to the staff. It's a cooperative now. No more standards of a man of my stature. Just people working for themselves." He stood up and looked around the cramped room. "But more importantly, I realized something. I've spent my life building empires of steel and glass. But those buildings don't care if I live or die. They don't laugh. They don't have memories." He turned back to Lydia. "I want to be a part of what's left. I don't expect you to love me. I don't even expect you to like me. But let me be the man you told Adara I was. Just once." Lydia looked at Adara. A silent conversation passed between mother and daughter. A lifetime of shared struggle, of whispered secrets, of surviving against the odds. Finally, Adara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The clinic," Lydia said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can Adara come too? I won't go without her." "Adara is the one in charge," Dominic said, looking at his daughter with a pride that was raw and new. "I'm just the one providing the transportation." The morning sun finally hit the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in 20 years, the air in the room didn't feel heavy with secrets. Later that morning, as they prepared to leave, Dominic stood on the small balcony, looking down at the city. From up here, he couldn't see the luxury cars or the velvet ropes. He only saw people, thousands of them, each with a story, each with a struggle. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Adara. She stood beside him, her dark skin a beautiful contrast to his pale, expensive shirt. She looked out at the skyline with him. "It looks different from down here, doesn't it?" she asked. "It was real," Dominic replied. He looked at her wrist, the jagged scar from the iron pot. He reached out and gently touched it. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever makes you feel small again." Adara looked at his hand, then at his face. The mic drop was no longer a weapon. It was a bridge. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Dominic," she said. But her voice had lost its jagged edge. "Just start by being there. That's more than enough." They walked back inside. The apartment was nearly empty now, most of their few belongings packed into simple boxes. A small, simple meal sat on the table, bread, some fruit, and the tea Lydia had made. Dominic sat down. He picked up a piece of fruit, his movements clumsy and uncertain in this humble setting. He looked at Lydia, who was smiling at him, not the girl from the beach, but a woman who had survived the storm and was finally seeing the sun. Dominic took a bite. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Success, he finally understood, wasn't measured by the height of a skyscraper or the weight of a bank account. It was measured by the people who stood beside you when the world went dark. It was measured by the courage to face your own shadow and the strength to mend what you had broken. As they walked out of the apartment for the last time, the billionaire who had built an empire finally realized he had never been truly rich. Not until this moment. Not until he had found the two women who had the power to fire him and the grace to hire him back as a father. The story was no longer about a billionaire and a waitress. It was about a family, an unfinished story, perhaps, but for the first time in 20 years, the next chapter was one they would write together.